Does it show recording, guys?
It shows recording on my end.
Okay. Should I do that again?
It does. It's working.
Okay, so anyway, I asked you to come so that we could be, looking at the way implementation is supposed to happen during this time, especially with school closures that are already existing, and then moving ahead with distance learning in a lot of our regions. And so I'm opening that up for anyone on the council that wants to ask questions. I particularly am looking at how to make sure that we have the services and supports and conversations, have conversations with the Department of Education. I don't know if that's going to help, but just to let them know that we are holding accountability with regards to services and supports during this time, and federal law mandates that they do the same. But also looking at how we can help the parents that may not have access to attorneys or advocates, per se, that are paid advocates, know the escalation process. Like, what can they do to make sure that their IEPs are implemented? And then what can National Parents Union do from the perspective of being a national parent-led council to help back their
Makes sense.
right.
So we had a good conversation, Christina, a few weeks ago before I jumped, before we scheduled this call. And one of the things we discussed was the U.S. Department of Education's position. So in response to the CARES Act, March 27th, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have heard of the CARES Act. It's the stimulus act that was passed on March 27th. In response to that, the U.S. Department of Education was directed by Congress to offer opinions about any waivers that should be implemented or in place as a result of the COVID crisis. And so the Secretary DeVos issued her opinion letter on April 27th, 2020, and essentially said, for IEP specifically, and a number of other things, but the core tenets of the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is intact. Meaning there are no waivers. The only extension that she was requesting or recommending to the congressional committees was for early intervention services, meaning children who are transitioning or would normally transition after 3 years old. They would receive an extended period of early intervention, which was actually a good a good extension for the benefit of the student. So they're really, as a result of that, school districts were scrambling to try to figure out what to do, because many school districts thought that they were going to receive a pass on what they had to do during the closures in terms of implementing IEPs, in terms of completing evaluations for students, and U.S. Department of Education made it clear that that's not the case. So as a result, recently, at least in California, on June 29th, we just saw that Senate Bill 98 just passed, which aligns very well with U.S. Department of Education's position on the school district's obligations and charter schools, public school obligations to implement IEPs. And the Ed Code's been amended, in fact, in California to ensure that a student's IEP has to be implemented even in a distance learning context. There isn't, what a lot of districts were calling emergency distance learning, which is really a small fraction of what the student may have been receiving in his or her IEP. That's no longer permitted, at least in my opinion, based on federal law. It never was permitted, but definitely based on California law under Senate Bill 98. So that's good news. Across the country, different school districts and different states may have their own mirroring laws, but ultimately the IDEA federal law governs, so that controls, and the states can't make laws that conflict with federal law. So they can't say, well, distance learning, we're gonna require the districts to do only a quarter of the services or half of the service that a child was receiving under the IEP. That's not permitted. That's not lawful. So
Tim, I'm sorry. Can you introduce who you Can you just make a formal introduction? That way everyone knows
Sure.
who there's, I know
I'm
who
Tim
I'm
Adams.
talking to, but.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Tim Adams. I'm an attorney in California, and my office is in Santa Ana, California. Been practicing law for almost 2 decades, and my primary practice is special education law.
Okay, and so welcome. This is part
Thank
of our
you.
MPU Council. And so anyone that has questions, please feel free to ask, seriously. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking about IDEA and you know, the fact that they were barely implementing, you know, IEPs correctly prior to school closures, but now that there's distance learning, and I think my biggest concern is for students that were receiving heavy services and supports like OT, like, you know, pull out types of interventions. What type of implementation is that going to look like, right? I'll give you an example. You know, if a student had some supports like peer builders or something like that for their cognitive auditory processing deficits, and they were working on that, pulled out 30 minutes a day. Now, how are they going to get that? Is the parent responsible for learning that whole platform that the speech pathologist was certified to do, and now getting that to the student on an iPad? Like, what does this all mean for parents, you know?
That's a good question. And I should have my newsletter out in the next couple of days to explain what, you know, what some of the options are, but school districts are not going to immediately be able to figure it out in a way that's effective for students. You know, what's going to happen is, it sounds good in theory, at least let's go with California, what California is doing, you know, that IEPs have to be implemented even in distance learning context. And we just heard from Governor Newsom on Friday that he's going to close public and private schools. So essentially, you know, in any county that's severely impacted by the coronavirus. So as a result of that, we're, you know, living in, you know, all the counties that the most populous counties, something like 80% of the population lives in, you know, all the counties that are most severely impacted. We're all going virtual again, and and we're getting a lot of response from families saying, what do we do next? How is this going to impact? They're accustomed to what the school district was providing in March and April and May and June of last school year. So that's what a lot of parents are expecting, that they're going to have to be the primary educator. So that's never been the case, and it shouldn't have been the case. This was, unfortunately, based on my research, it had a lot to do with public employee unions negotiating agreements with school districts, more so than determining what was appropriate for students, but really guaranteeing full-time salaries and benefits, which hamstrung school districts in really creating a program that was appropriate for its students. So we saw that under Senate Bill 117, and now, you know, we're seeing 98, which essentially is for the 2021 school year. And again, speaking specifically to California, it's, you know, we're hopeful that the implementation will be comparable, because that's what is required under federal law. The services in a child's IEP have to be comparable, whether it's in a brick and mortar setting at a school or whether it's in the home. It's got to be comparable. So if that requires that school districts make up lost time by hiring private agencies to make up services like occupational therapy or physical therapy or speech therapy, these are claims that almost every family that has an IEP would have for what we call compensatory education. If it's going to require, on a going forward basis, school districts to either hire additional staff to provide instruction in home, if it can't be effectively addressed in a distance learning context, meaning like via computer, because you can't really deliver physical therapy services on a computer, right? So if you've got a student that needs that type of service, it's really going to have to be delivered in person. And there's plenty of agencies around the country that are still open, because there's a lot of people that need physical therapy. My office is next door to a physical therapist's office, and I see people coming out of there all day long. Just because the coronavirus exists doesn't mean that you can't get in-person services. And there's nothing unlawful about having services provided. It's just not as cost effective and is not as convenient, but school districts ultimately will have to do that. So and this is not going to be automatic. As you know, Christina, when we tell the school district you violated the law, what are they going to say in response? They're going to say, we did
Right.
everything right, that there's, that our position is that we provided the student a free, appropriate public education. We all know that's not correct. We all know that what they did, they violated the student's rights, but they're almost always going to take the position they did nothing wrong. So many parents are going to have to use the Office for Civil Rights to file complaints. They're going to have to use the due process hearing procedures in order to request that a judge review the IEP and what the district wasn't doing. That's more like a request for a trial. It's more involved in that regard, but you were asking about how do you escalate it? Well, I would start as a parent writing a letter saying, here's my expectation for the school year. Here's my child's IEP. District, what are you going to provide that's consistent with my child's IEP? And if the district writes back and says, and they have a duty to write back under Title 34 CFR 300-503, they have a prior written notice requirement. So anytime a parent makes a request, or there's going to be an initiated change, or parents are entitled to a response under 34 CFR 300-503. So the school district has to write back and provide information as to what they're going to do or what they're not going to do. And if their letter doesn't indicate that they're going to comply with the IEP, the next step would be to file a complaint. And like I said, every state has its own process. You may file what we call a compliance complaint with the State Department of Education. If it's more of a clear-cut issue on the district not implementing what's written in the IEP. If we have more of a subjective concern, my child requires a greater level of service and the school district's not providing that, that may be something for a judge to decide. Does the child need makeup services of 50 hours of speech and language therapy? Or is the child okay receiving 20 makeup hours? I mean, this is a question for a judge at some point, because compensatory education is what we call an equitable remedy. So ultimately, parents are going to have to get a position in writing from the school district if the school district if they suspect that the school district is going to refuse to implement IEPs. But the law is on the parent side. And it's very clear, like I said, under federal law, and now in many states are passing laws like California, making it abundantly clear that the school district has to implement the services that in a child's IEP in a comparable fashion, even if it's distance learning.
Okay, so I'm gonna let the people in the council that have asked questions in the chat, starting with Vivette, go ahead and ask their questions so that if they want to expound on those. Vivette, I saw that you oh no, actually it was Bernita. I'm sorry Vivette. Bernita, if you could just say where you're at and if you want to ask your question about the homeschool question.
Hi, this is Bernita. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and just had a question, like the IEP services, how does that impact parents who are now thinking about transitioning from public school, that online learning sessions portion that we just had, to strictly homeschool? How would does this still cover their IEP supports or like services? What? I don't know.
Well, with respect to homeschool, if you're going to be a private homeschooler, it's very state specific in terms of what the rules are. So in Michigan, the rules may be different from California. There is not really a set of federal rules that govern homeschooling options. So we'd have to talk to somebody in Michigan specifically. But generally speaking, if a parent homeschools and they're not enrolled in a local education agency like a public school district or a public charter school, then the parent's on her own with respect to the IEP, unless your state says something different. So if you say, hey, I'm done with the distance learning, I'm just going to go homeschool, you'd have to check with your state Department of Education as to what your rights are in that, because like I said, they're state specific.
Okay, Christy had a question. Christy.
Yes, my question was pretty simple and I think general because we're seeing it across. So I'm Christy Moreno. I'm
Nice to meet you.
connected. Nice to meet you. I'm in Kansas City, Missouri.
Okay.
We've had huge budget cuts, obviously, for education, and special education has been one of the hardest hit. So my question was around that. How are we going to make in-home services happen? Like, who's going to be paying for those? What is the solution there?
Well, regardless of the budget cuts, and this happens all the time, the federal mandates are still the same. So a child is entitled to a program that's reasonably calculated to confer an educational benefit based on their unique circumstances. It's also got to be a program that's appropriately ambitious. And I'm quoting from Andrew F., which is a March 2017 U.S. Supreme Court case. So that's across the board in every state and territory. This is what the school district's obligations are, regardless of how much money they have. So whether the program costs $50 or $500,000, they have to find a way to pay for it. So in reality, yes, I understand that budgets are tight. It's the same across the board. Our country is struggling. We're borrowing more money, way more money than we have to pay for debts. We're trying to stimulate economy the best we can, but you know, there are going to be budget cuts as a result of a lot of people being out of work. At least I can answer in my state, we depend heavily on income taxes. We've got a huge income tax, state income tax, and school districts and public charters are going to feel the pinch. But that doesn't relieve them of their obligations to implement IEPs. But you are going to see pushback. You are going to see school districts and public schools trying to reduce costs as much as possible. So it's up to the parent to further inquire, to push back if they need to, and say, look, my child does need that service, and that service is crucial to ensure that she accesses her education. If she doesn't receive it, she will be denied her right to access education and denied her right to a FAPE, a free appropriate public education. So yeah, the practical, I mean, the simple response is yes, you're going to see some pushback, but it wouldn't be lawful for a school district not to fund a program that we clearly know that the student needs.
Tim, now with regards to reasonable, and I know we've had this conversation several times, like who gets to interpret what's reasonable and the reasonable time frame in which, you know, these things should be taking place. Like, I don't think parents should have to wait 5 months and the district says, well, that's reasonable. We were looking for something, or is it reasonable that parents should be expected to look up on a list of people that they contract with, or can the parent go and find, you know, someone that they'd like to contract with? Like, what is that reasonable part? Like, it's vague. Is it up to interpretation from the district or the parent?
Well, the school district ultimately, or the public school ultimately, has a duty to provide the services that a student needs to access his or her education. That's their job. If the parent doesn't feel that the school district is doing that, then the parent can give written notice, and within 10 days of placing a student in a private program or a private service, and tell the district they're going to seek reimbursement for that cost because the district hasn't met its obligations. So the parent doesn't have to wait necessarily, but the concern is, if is the parent going to get paid back? Well, the parent has the burden of proof. So if the parent says, hey, I don't think your service or program, or the lack of a service or program, is appropriate, the parent has to, file a complaint with the state and prove it to a judge at some point, to a hearing officer or an administrative law judge. So, but districts have a duty to respond within a reasonable time. So when a parent makes a request, the school district has to respond. And typically we see responses within 30 to 45 days in writing. And that's under that Title 34 CFR 300-503. That's the prior written notice requirement. So although it's the parent's burden to show that it's appropriate, if the district says no, the district still has to take action. If the district sends the parent an IEP that the parent doesn't think is appropriate, the district has to prove it's appropriate. In some states, they even have to file for due process to prove that it's appropriate. So that's really, many of my clients decide they're going to privately place and they're going to pursue reimbursement, and that's when we file the complaint.
Okay, Vivette has a question.
Sure.
Hi, Attorney Adams. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
So I am an educator in the New York City Department of Education, and I have a meeting with parents this evening as a part of my school community. And many parents come to teachers to look for counsel as to what they should do regarding their children who are not having their IEP services met. What basic things can you advise me to take and use to inform them? Specifically, they're making decisions about hybrid learning models versus remote models. And many parents are feeling pushed to consider the hybrid model, even though it goes against their better judgment for safety reasons, because they think it's the only way their child will get the services they need is if they risk their lives to go into the school. How can I advise them better? Who can help them? Who's on the East Coast? Who's in New York? Who can help them? Is it a paralegal can write this? You know, I want to have some kind of concrete things to give them, because they're very, very lost and they're very concerned. And all they keep hearing at every meeting is that we're waiting for further guidance. We don't know. So they're looking for answers and they're not getting them. And I would like to be able to provide them with something to give them real concrete support.
Sure. So one of the organizations that I'm a member of is the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, or COPA. It's a nonprofit organization, and I believe, Christina, you're probably familiar with COPA. They've got a database, a nationwide database of practitioners all throughout the country. And I'm on that for California, but there would be, practitioners in New York and every other state. Depending on the size of the population in the state, there's likely going to be more for more populous states than there would for less populous states. But COPA is a really, really good resource. They're also a good resource for policy, and they just issued their opinion, and they also file what we call amicus briefs to support claims that are in various courts across the country. So appeals courts, that are considering a legal issue. So just that would be your best source of information, to go to COPA and to find some New York specific practitioners to talk to about what's happening there. But I can generally say that the U.S. Department of Education, their letter and their guidance is also very helpful, and that's going to apply across the board to all states. So you can find that on the U.S. Department of Education's website, and you can also direct people to the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. It may not be an organization that your school district would necessarily agree with in every respect, because it's more student focused, right? So they may frown upon that, but certainly the U.S. Department of Education has some really good direction, and they're very much on the family side. Their positions are very family centric right now. Not all the time, but right now in the midst of the coronavirus and the COVID-19 crisis.
And so I do have to say that, yes, I am a fan of COPA, because, I don't see the districts changing the way that they're doing these things. They were barely doing what was right by the special education students before, so I'm not one to continue to battle them with that. That's why I homeschool through the charter school. But there are parents that have this realistic, desire to see what's going to happen. Now, with regards to OCR, though, Tim, I don't know how helpful that's going to be with special education. I know last year when I talked to COPA, a lot of attorneys were having difficulty getting OCR to do what OCR was supposed to do in this area. And in fact, it may take a long time for OCR to get back to you. And so putting power in the hands of parents is really what I prefer to do. And so I don't know how we as a council can basically give steps, and if you could share your newsletter with us, that would be great.
You've been receiving it already, and I should have another one out. Like I said, a lot of some of my advice is going to be specific to California, but I always include federal requirements as well. So your states individually may have provide greater benefits to residents than federal law does, and that's okay. California does that sometimes as well. With respect to OCR, I 100% agree with you. If you're filing a complaint with OCR, this is, that's something that may take a very long time for resolution. I know there were a lot of budget cuts when the Trump administration took over, and as a result of that, we're seeing fewer OCR investigations. So I'm not saying necessarily that you should use OCR as the primary means to enforce your rights. I'm simply saying they're a good resource for direction, like the Secretary DeVos letter that was sent on April 27th, or a variety of other guidance letters. So in terms of guidance, they may be a good source of guidance, but not necessarily a good source of enforcement or good means to enforce. I would strongly encourage families to consider using their State Department of Education for enforcement through a compliance complaint, or a due process hearing request, or due process complaint, we call it in California.
Unless you're in California, then you don't use the State Department of Education.
Well,
no,
yeah.
That's just no. That's just
I know. State Department of Education in California is hit and miss, because
right.
keep in mind, these are not judges or lawyers when you file a compliance complaint. These are usually, they're folks that have some limited legal training. They have a lot of experience usually working in the public school system on some level. They may have worked for a public school district in the past, but in terms of analyzing facts and making legal conclusions, that's not their role. What they're good at is determining if a student didn't receive, which is say, 100 hours of speech therapy over the course of the school year that they were entitled to, and the district can't produce evidence that shows that they provided that 100 hours, then they will order the district to make up the time. So it's really the issues that are really cut and dried, I should say. They're either, they're one way or the other. You've got to show evidence that they're clearly either in compliance or not in compliance. That's the only time I typically would use a compliance complaint. For me in my office, generally, we're seeking some sort of compensatory education that usually often involves reimbursement for something my clients have paid for, or services or programs in the future, like a private program because the school district hasn't offered something appropriate. The best means of getting that in place is through the due process hearing. And not that you have to go through a trial every time, but at least filing the complaint to get the resolution meeting in session, to get a mediation conference, and those are important. And the vast majority of cases end up resolving through the settlement process and don't have to go through an actual trial. We call it a due process hearing.
Tafshir, I see that you have a question. Please, go, by all means, ask.
She hopped off the meeting.
Oh, Tafshir did? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Her question was, they have meetings. Okay, so what she said was, can schools legally require families to sign a waiver to not hold the school district liable if their child gets hurt during the virtual services like occupational therapy that they need based on their IEP?
Can they require it as a condition to implement an IEP? Absolutely not. They can't require it. Are school districts asking, can you voluntarily sign a waiver? You certainly can. There's nothing in the law that would make as a precondition a parent sign a waiver to get a service, unless it's some sort of settlement agreement. Settlement agreements, possibly, yes, absolutely. We do it all the time. Districts say, you're not going to sue us. We'll give you something we don't think you necessarily deserve or you're entitled to, or that we don't want to give you in exchange for that. But as part of, there's no quid pro quo in an IEP itself. So it's not a requirement.
Okay, and let's see. I think that Christy, does anyone else have a question? Because if not, I will have a very particular question with regard to.
I'd like to ask a question, please. I just want to clarify to make sure that I got this right, because I'm in Ohio. I want to make sure that COPA, you said COPA, that it's the same for here as well. Like,
Yeah.
okay, just want to make sure.
COPA is a national organization. So you can find a database of advocates and lawyers for all states on the COPA website. And you would just search the type of issue or concern you have related to education or students or disabilities. And then COPA will have, should have a referral for you. Now, these are private practitioners. They don't work for COPA, just like I have my own law practice. I'm just on a list of referrals. But COPA itself is also a good resource. If you go to their website, there's a lot of information that could be very helpful, even specific to your state, because COPA is tracking what different states are doing, what different circuits that govern, that control courts, circuit courts that control laws in your state.
Okay, great.
And I put it in the chat. Tim, what was the name of the, go ahead, Bernita, ask for the bills that you're asking for so I can put it in the chat. Says the link to the bills.
Oh, Senate Bill 98, that's a California specific bill, and then Senate Bill 117 is also California specific. So if you do a Google search, if you're looking for California, that's only going to pertain to California. But Senate Bill 117 is, really just applied to the 1920 school year. So we're moving into Senate Bill 98. But if it's for other states, it's not going to apply.
I think you were talking about HR. I forgot what the code you were talking about with regards to federal. And then we had some other people had.
Oh, you're talking about the U.S. Department of Education's letter, right? I can send that. I can, in my last newsletter, Christina, it's actually, there's a link to it. So the one that you replied to get this meeting set up, there's actually a link to the U.S. Department of Education and Secretary DeVos, her direction or her response to Congress.
Okay, and then there is another question. Let me see that I make sure I get that. Are there agencies that can help with filing complaints for parents that are low English proficiency? I think COPA could probably send people in the right direction for that too.
COPA would be a good resource for that. There are state-specific agencies. I mean, in California, we tend to have a lot more options. Disability Rights California, but again, these are specific to our state. And I apologize, I don't know what's available in each and every state, because my primary practice is here. So I can give you some national organizations like COPA, but for the most part, I know the state organizations really well.
And so the other thing was, and I know this one's huge, a lot of parents have been really concerned about students that are going to have their triannual or annual meetings, but they haven't been addressed to date about those meetings. I even have parents with kids with 504s concerned, like, what's this gonna look like? I'm like, my kid's 504 hasn't even been updated.
Sure.
And so that's a whole nother thing. Should they be requesting to have those meetings ASAP?
Yes. Many school districts are actually trying to complete their triennial assessments even over the summer, at least in our state, Christina, California, because they realize that they're running out of time, and they're already, in some cases, 4 months behind on the triennial assessment. So there isn't any waiver, as you recall, of IDA requirements. And one of the requirements is to reassess a student every 3 years. That's the triennial. So if they've missed it by 4 months, that's 4 months where a student could have been receiving a service that was identified as necessary as a result of the assessment. And now, we're 4 months behind, and the student isn't receiving a service or a program that could have been identified. So absolutely, they need to get a hold of their district and find out what are you going to do to get this assessment completed, and make sure it's in writing that they're requesting that their triennial IEP be held as soon as possible.
Okay, so I started screen sharing. I saw this last week, and I was thinking, how feasible would this be for each of us to really take a group of parents and do this? per region. I don't think it could be done on the national level, of course, because the U.S. Department of Education gave specific guidelines and the districts are not following them and they're not compliant. So have you seen this, Tim?
Yeah, there actually, especially with Governor Newsom's announcement on Friday, I got a slew of emails over the weekend from families, existing clients and just families, potential clients looking to file a claim because of concerns about distance learning. Keep in mind, like I said, it's going to be state by state, so state specific, because every state has the responsibility to implement programs. But federal law still controls. So could you do a lawsuit across the country? Not really, because your lawsuit would be specific to families in one state. So you'd have maybe a group of families. You could do a group of families suing the state in California, and then a separate group of families suing the state in Arizona or the State Department of Education.
Right. And so if we collectively did that, though, I think that would send a great message. And I don't know
Yeah,
what your thought about that is.
It would be different lawsuits in different courts. Yeah, and so you'd have to avoid what's called exhausting administrative remedies. You'd have to show that everybody really that exhaustion is futile, meaning like there would be no point in going through a due process proceeding for 100 different families first, because usually the requirement is you've got to go through due process and then you can get to federal court or a state court to pursue your claim. In this circumstance, if the violation equally impacts those 100 families, hypothetically, then you may be able to avoid the exhaustion requirement, meaning you don't have to go through due process, you can go straight to court.
I think, Christy, that probably would apply to where you're at. I know Yahaira's in Boston. She just texted me and she said she couldn't make it, but I know that would definitely apply to where she's at. There's no other school options where she's at except for the district school, and they've been out of compliance, right? And so right now, there have been a couple of parents asking her, how can they just get their kids funding and do what they want to do? And so I think you answered that with the contract piece, right?
Well, they would definitely want to tell the district that they feel the program isn't appropriate, that they're requesting private placement, and it would be negotiated at that point, usually, unless they went through a due process hearing, and the parent would then have to show why the program that was offered is not adequate. And if, for example, like many districts were doing, they're not providing the same level or the same quality of related services like speech and OT and physical therapy or whatever is required, and providing just a fraction of their daily schedule. They're getting, let's just say, a half an hour a day of direct instruction from their teacher when they used to get 4 hours a day. Then I think their claim is much stronger, because they're picking something, they're choosing an alternative program that better addresses their child's needs.
I see what you're saying, because it's very difficult when you have a child that is autistic and you're trying to do occupational therapy online, right?
Yeah, you can't.
Right.
You can't do. There's certain things you can't do online. Now you could do maybe a speech therapy online. Okay, that's possible. But what if you've got a child that can't engage? It's not a preferred activity, and they can't engage with the screen, right? Even having this conversation, even though I know it's live, it still feels different than if you were sitting in my chair at my desk in front of me or across the table in a conference. I mean, it still feels different. And a lot of students can't, they just can't maintain that attention span to gain any benefit from that. So in that circumstance, there's, Senate Bill 98 in California envisions the need for in-person instruction, because there are exceptions. I mean, there's a lot of kids that could probably do it okay. I know kids that are they're self-starters and they can get it done, but there's a lot of, many of my clients that are eligible for special education, they have attention deficits, and it's really tough. I mean, it's tough enough if it's in person. It's even harder unless it's a preferred activity for them to engage with the screen.
So that's pretty much. Bernita, do you have any questions, or Christy, do you have any more questions? I know that it's a lot to process, so some people will probably get back to me with their questions that had to go.
Sure.
But I think that what I would like to do, as far as the education committee of the of MPU, is definitely come up with a statement from National Parents Union, if it's okay, and we can quote some of your newsletter
Sure.
information.
Yes.
Because we're going to put that out nationally, and to probably follow up with some media interviews. That's what happens when we put out national statements. But just with particularly with regards to IEP implementation and what parents should be seeking, and what they should be looking for, just reiterating their rights. Christy, we could probably add in that U.S. Department of Education letter response to Congress, and then add in, if COPA allows them as a reference, a point of reference. But is there anything that we could do as a parent-led organization to nationally push, besides just informing people? Like, it's hard,
Yeah, you just be a resource to families. The situation's very fluid. And so even, Friday afternoon, last Friday, I'm finishing up a federal court mediation virtually, of course. And, the governor's concurrently on literally changing the rules. And so it's like a moving target, as we say, right? You don't know what to expect. And so trying to pin down a particular state, or even the counties are doing different things, as you know, Christina, in California.
Right.
You may have Orange County doing something completely different than LA County. And school districts also have discretion. So the governor did say, look, all the school districts and the private schools and the charter schools are going to have to go virtual. He did, for all these counties that are severely impacted by COVID-19. So that made it very clear. But before that, it was everyone's best guess. Are we going to go virtual? Are we going to go is it in person? Is it a hybrid? These are all, I think, just being a resource to families and putting out information that could be potentially helpful, and providing organizations that could answer some of their questions. Unfortunately, we don't have hard and fast, rules on everything yet. This is a completely different world that we live in. And even though the law still applies, the facts are different. And there's a lot, you could have the same set of facts, and you could have even 5 different judges and get 5 different opinions, and because we're all human beings. So we have to do our best to try to come up with the best resources and ensure that parents have access to that information.
How do you feel about that, Christy, for us to take it back to Education Committee and create that as a resource, and then make up a statement like the Family Bill of Rights, but for special education? Yeah.
I love it. And I would love to have an FAQ kind of list, like parents that have questions. What kind of questions would we have? We already post some here, but I can tell you my question was 2 weeks right before COVID hit and kids were sent to school. My son was going through evaluations for a 504 plan implementation, and we were just left hanging. So I don't even have anything to build from. Like, we don't have anything that has been officially, other than his pediatrician's diagnosis for ADD, to really, kick off what we're going to do. So I think it would be very beneficial to have an FAQ, Christina, as a resource too, so that people can go to that and maybe provide links and resources externally.
Yeah, Tim, like how would that work? Like, if parents were mid-assessment or discovered that there may be something going on with their child while they've been schooling from home, right? Like, how would they be able to access? Yeah, that's interesting. IEP.
So they'd have the same rights, Christina, if they're no different than if they were in the public school setting. Even parents that are in private schools that have never enrolled in a public system, they also have the same rights. In fact, school districts have what we call a child find obligation, where they have to search and serve the community. They have to put options up on their website. They have to post at local community centers. if you have a child that you suspect has a disability, they have to search and serve and try to find kids that may need help, either 504 plans or IEPs. So that's already part of the system that's already set up. And that's regardless of whether it's distance learning or not. There's been a lot of homeschooled kids that parents didn't know that it was an option to ask the school district for help. So parent can send a letter requesting assistance and asking for an assessment, and the district would then have to respond and complete that assessment.
Right, and Christy, as you know, they probably will not do the kind of assessment that we're looking for. So then we're gonna have to be able to refer them to people like Tim or through COPA, you know what I mean? So that now what's your next step? Because I really don't want our parents nationally to be having to go through all these hoops just to get an IEP or just to get those services and supports like Barton. You know what I mean? I've had parents crying, fighting over Barton. How come they can't get Barton, right? And it's ridiculous.
And so, and remember, Christine, there's an option too. If the parent asks for an assessment, the district does an assessment, we don't agree with it, we can get an independent educational evaluation, or at least request one, and the district has to respond and either fund that assessment, but that second opinion, by a qualified person the parent selects, or they have to file a due process hearing request and defend the district's testing. So those are the two options, and it's not the parent's burden, it's the district's burden to respond in one of those two ways. And you're familiar with the independent evaluation process.
Right. Christy, are you aware of the independent evaluation process? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Hoping
We need
that
to start
insurance
really
could cover things.
right, but you know what? No, the district needs to pay for that. Like it needs to be funded by the district. We need to start pushing our parents to do that. And then if you know, we have to inform them to seek privatization of their child's education. I really see that as the only option for most of our parents, especially during this time. Bernita says, and then we're going to close. It's ironic, all these things we've had to endure as parents. Have we ever thought all of it was to do the work we are doing with the passion that's shown on our cause? This is mind-blowing how we're designed for this work, even in the midst of it hurting us. I agree, Bernita. I definitely agree. My son has been one of those people that wasn't served well. And I pulled him out, but not all parents have that option. And so trying to serve the multitudes is also looking at multi-layers of approaches. I think giving a guideline with some resources would be the first step. And then if parents do, like Bernita asked about privatization, if you do choose that, showing them how to file that private school affidavit so that they can homeschool. Tim, were you aware that some states closed their private school affidavit portal so that parents weren't able to pull their kids out?
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I wasn't aware of which states specifically, but it doesn't surprise me. I think that, again, when you have a system that's trying to control what families do, and this is, I think, in my opinion, we can talk offline about this as just an opinion, but I think that there was a lot of concern from school districts specifically about charter schools opening when they were closed, or private schools opening when they were closed. Because you know what happens when you've got a charter opening but the school district isn't, then parents are looking at in-person options. They're flocking to the school that's open. So I think the intent perhaps last week with the governor's announcement is motivated also in part by trying to level the playing field. Right. And say, okay, well, the districts aren't going to open, but neither are private schools and neither are public charters. And
that's exactly what's happening here.
Yeah.
But not in Milwaukee. In Wisconsin and in Milwaukee, MPS, which is the public school system, can open, but all parochial and charter schools have to remain closed.
Yeah. See that's, That's not fair. That's
Right.
not equitable.
Well,
right?
they have a voucher system, and so the parents are trying to fight back with regards to their vouchers. It's just a slew of things. And so I want to just really be able to make sure that parents aren't feeling trapped, trapped in bad schools. That's what we fight for, and so how we can come up with, and I can run it by you prior to publication, a way that they can feel that they're empowered to do something different. I've been teaching the concept of not fighting districts because, like you say, can't change their behavior, but we can change ours. And
Yes.
so let's see how that looks, and let's move forward with the statement. And, I know we have 5 minutes left. Thank you so much, Tim, for your time.
It was a pleasure meeting you all.
Right. And some people
Thanks for the
couldn't be
invitation.
here. Yeah, no, it's okay. We love having information to help parents.
We're going to talk tomorrow too, Christina. We've got
Yes.
a 10:45 on Facebook Live, right?
That goes out to about 25,000 viewers.
Okay. So if there's
No
something you want
pressure.
to chat about in preparation for that, is it going to be a similar format to today? Meaning you're going to post some questions?
It'll be me and you. And you could definitely touch on just like, look, we have a bigger skill set with the council than some average everyday parents. Just be honest, right? So we can be talking about idea and faith, and they don't, that's not a concept that our parents, we have to break that down.
Sure.
And if we start talking about this letter to Congress, and I'm not saying all parents are like that, but a lot of them, and if we start talking about the concept of the U.S. Department of Education's response to Congress, that's going to be something that we can just discuss and break down, right?
Okay.
But I think it's absolutely necessary, because what happens is when you raise that awareness, parents understand why I got robbed.
Yes.
This, I don't know about all those terminologies and things like that, but I do know my kid's getting robbed. And
Yes.
there's something
Yes.
that I need to do now.
And now in California, Christina, not only are public school attendees being robbed, but private schools as well. I had a lot of families that said, look, I wanted to exercise my right to send my child to a private parochial school. And now the governor says, I can't even do that. They can't go to a church-based school. So that's causing a lot of frustration. And some of our mutual friends, we were all on an email string last week talking about options.
Listen, I attend alumni network meetings with USD, and I started saying, like, what is your focus gonna be on this? Like, a lot of the kids come from Francis Parker to USD or other schools, and I think that you guys are gonna have to make a statement about what's happening with how they're attacking these choice options, because you're a choice option at a higher level, right? And so, I don't know what that's gonna look like, but I started bringing it up in those meetings. Like, we have to push for our private university here to make some statements about what's happening with the choice platforms at the lower level, period.
Well, thanks for talking to me today. I'll let you guys, if you have any more questions for today, because I'm going to likely have to jump into another meeting pretty soon.
Christy, do you have any questions?
I don't, but just wanted to thank you very much for your time. As you know, this has been recorded, and we're going to share this link with all of our other NPU council members.
Happy.
Even though you just saw like 4 or 5 people here, you have a broader audience. Thank
Wonderful.
you so much.
And I'm always happy to be a resource to your council and to your families. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Christy. Do I have to ask COPA for permission to use them as a resource in a publication?
No, I list them as a resource. I don't believe you have to ask them for permission necessarily if you include their website.
Okay.
I think it would probably be, I'm sure they would be delighted to say yes if you say, hey, look, I'm this organization. I'd like to list you as a resource. You can ask them as a courtesy, but I think a lot of people list COPA.
Okay.
Because they're a nonprofit and they're a good resource, they probably wouldn't mind. But go ahead and ask them.
Okay, thank you so much,
You're
Tim.
very
I'll
welcome.
be
I
writing
look forward to
that
talking to you tomorrow.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.